The girl is 18 years old. Her name is Lucia Junia Balba. Right now, she is standing in her family's villa, staring at a piece of papyrus that has just destroyed her entire world. The message is brief, formal, written in the impersonal language of imperial bureaucracy. But everyone in the room understands what it actually means, what it really says beneath the polite words about honor and attendance and the emperor's pleasure in receiving distinguished guests. Lucia Junia Balba is invited to attend a private gathering at the imperial residence. Her presence is requested 3 days hence. Appropriate attire is expected. Refusal is not mentioned as an option because refusal is not an option. This is not an invitation. This is a summons. And everyone knows what happens at these gatherings. Her father stands across the room. Senator Marcus Junius Balbus, a man who has served Rome for 30 years, who has held every major office short of consul, who has commanded legions and governed provinces and sat in the Senate during 5 different reigns. He is staring at his daughter with an expression she has never seen on his face before. It takes her a moment to recognize what she is seeing. Her father is terrified. Her mother has gone completely white, has actually swayed on her feet like she might faint. The servants who brought the message have backed out of the room without being dismissed because they understand that this is a private family catastrophe and that witnessing it might be dangerous. 3 days. That is how long Lucia has before she must present herself at the palace outside Rome where the emperor has established his residence. The emperor who has never once entered the city itself during 3 years of rule, who governs from a commandeered estate that no one from his previous life would recognize. That has been transformed into something the original owners could not have imagined in their worst nightmares. 3 days before Lucia must attend a gathering that survivors do not discuss, that families who receive their daughters back speak of only in whispers behind closed doors, that senators mention in coded language when they think no one is listening. That has become the single most feared event in Roman aristocratic life, more feared than execution, more feared than exile, more feared than torture, because at least those things end. What happens at the emperor's gatherings does not end. It continues. It persists. It follows survivors for the rest of their shortened lives. Lucia knows this. Everyone knows this. In the 3 years since Maximinus Thrax seized power, the stories have spread through the senatorial class like infection. Stories about girls who attended gatherings. Stories about what they looked like when they came back. Stories about the sounds that carried from the private chambers. Stories about the special entertainment that the emperor reserves for daughters whose fathers have displeased him. And Lucia's father has displeased the emperor. 2 weeks ago, Senator Marcus Junius Balbus stood in the Senate and raised objections to a new round of property confiscations. Did not even object strongly. Simply noted that perhaps the seizures were proceeding too rapidly. That perhaps some families deserved hearings before losing estates their ancestors had held for centuries. That perhaps Rome should maintain at least the appearance of legal process even in times of military emergency. The words were mild. The tone was respectful. The senator carefully avoided any direct criticism of the emperor himself. But everyone in the chamber understood what was being said, and apparently someone reported it. Someone always reports it. The informant networks that Maximinus has established throughout the city are thorough. No senatorial conversation goes unobserved. No criticism goes unreported. No family is beyond reach. And now the summons has arrived. Lucia looks at her father, looks at her mother, looks at the papyrus that has just sentenced her to attend one of the most notorious events in the empire, and she understands with perfect clarity that her father's mild objection 2 weeks ago has condemned her to whatever happens at those gatherings, that his political courage has purchased her suffering, that in 3 days she will learn firsthand why survivors refuse to speak about what occurs in the emperor's private chambers. She is 18 years old. She has never been to the palace, has never seen the emperor except from a distance during public ceremonies, has lived a sheltered aristocratic life surrounded by books and music and gardens. Her parents had been planning her marriage, had been negotiating with several prominent families, had been discussing dowries and alliances and the future she would build with some senator's son who would value her education and her family connections. All of that is gone now. The families who were negotiating for her hand will withdraw. No one marries daughters who have attended the emperor's gatherings. Not because of any formal prohibition, but because everyone understands that these girls return changed, return damaged, return carrying something that makes normal life impossible. 3 days, 72 hours until Lucia must present herself at the palace gates wearing her finest silks and her father's gold jewelry and an expression that suggests she is honored by the invitation rather than paralyzed with terror. 72 hours until she learns what actually happens at the gatherings. 72 hours until she discovers what the special entertainment is. On the third day, Lucia is dressed in her best stola, deep purple silk that cost her father more than most families earn in a year. Her hair is arranged in the elaborate style reserved for state occasions, each curl positioned precisely, each pin weighted with pearls. She wears the gold necklace her father gave her on her 16th birthday, the matching earrings her mother commissioned from the best jeweler in Rome. She looks like what she is supposed to be, a young woman of distinguished family attending an imperial function, an honor, a privilege, a mark of favor. She looks nothing like what she feels, which is a prisoner being transported to execution. The journey to the palace takes 2 hours. Her father insisted on accompanying her in the litter, rode beside her in silence because there is nothing to say. What words exist for this situation? What comfort can a father offer a daughter he is sending to horror because refusing the summons would destroy the entire family? Because the emperor's reach extends to everyone. Because protecting Lucia by defying the invitation would only result in soldiers arriving to take her by force, along with her mother and her younger sisters, and probably her father himself for execution. At least this way only Lucia suffers, at least the rest of the family survives, at least her younger sisters remain unknown to imperial attention. These are the calculations that aristocratic families make under Maximinus. These are the choices that empire has reduced them to. Sacrifice one daughter or lose everyone. Send the girl to the gathering or watch the entire family die. The palace appears through the trees. It had been a senator's estate before Maximinus seized it. A beautiful property with extensive gardens and elegant architecture and the kind of refined taste that comes from generations of wealth and education. The emperor has transformed it. The gardens are overgrown. The elegant architecture is obscured by new construction that looks military rather than residential. Walls have been built. Guard towers have been added. The whole complex now resembles a fortress more than a residence, a place designed not for comfort, but for control, for keeping people in rather than welcoming them. The litter stops at the main gate. Guards appear. Not Romans, barbarians from the northern frontiers. Giants by normal standards, though Lucia will soon learn they are small compared to their master. They check documents, verify identities. One of them looks at Lucia with an expression she cannot read. Pity, maybe, or anticipation, or simple indifference to what awaits her inside. Her father tries to enter with her, is stopped immediately. Only the invited may pass beyond this point. Lucia sees him arguing with the guards, sees him gesturing, sees him doing something she has never witnessed before, sees her father begging, pleading to be allowed to accompany his daughter, to at least see where she is being taken, to maintain some illusion that he has any control over what happens next. The guards refuse. Their orders are clear. The senator's daughter enters. The senator does not. No exceptions. No negotiations. No aristocratic privilege that matters against imperial command. Lucia watches her father's face as he realizes he cannot protect her, cannot follow her, cannot even know what happens to her beyond these gates. She sees something break in his expression, sees him age a decade in the span of seconds, sees him understand that he has failed at the most fundamental duty a father has, that his political objection has purchased his daughter's suffering, that whatever happens in the next hours will be his fault, and he will carry that knowledge until he dies. She wants to tell him it is not his fault, that he should not blame himself. That speaking truth in the Senate is what a senator is supposed to do, but the guards are already escorting her through the gate, already leading her down a path that winds through the overgrown gardens toward the main building, already taking her away from her father who stands at the entrance watching his daughter disappear and knowing he will never see the same girl again. Inside the palace, the transformation is complete. Whatever beauty this estate once possessed has been erased. The frescoes that decorated the walls have been covered with hangings that depict acts Lucia does not have words for. Bodies intertwined in ways that seem anatomically impossible. Faces expressing not pleasure, but agony. Scenes that look more like torture than anything else. The floors that once featured intricate mosaics are now stained with substances Lucia does not want to identify, The elegant furniture has been replaced with military camp chairs and rough tables. Everything refined has been removed. Everything brutal has been emphasized. The air is thick with incense that fails to mask other smells. Wine that has been spilled and not cleaned. Meat that has been left to decay. Sweat and fear and something animal. Something that makes Lucia's primitive hindbrain scream warnings her conscious mind is trying to ignore. She is led to a large marble hall that might once have been used for philosophical lectures or poetry readings. Now it serves a different purpose. Other girls are already here. Lucia counts them quickly. 11, including herself, that makes 12. All of them between 16 and 20 years old. All of them dressed in their finest clothing. All of them daughters of senators. All of them wearing expressions that range from confusion to barely concealed terror. They were collected over the past 3 days, summoned from their homes in groups of 3 or 4, transported here in covered litters, told nothing about what awaited them, told only that the emperor had requested their presence and that attendance was mandatory, and that their families' futures depended on their cooperation. Lucia recognizes 2 of the girls, Cornelia and Valeria, daughters of senators her father knows, girls she has seen at social functions. They recognize her as well. Their eyes meet across the hall. No one speaks. What would they say? They all understand why they are here. They all know what gatherings like this mean. They have all heard the stories about what happens in the private chambers, about the special entertainment, about the girls who attend and return broken or do not return at all. Servants move through the hall. More barbarians. They carry amphorae of wine, platters loaded with meat, other items whose purposes Lucia cannot determine, but whose shapes make her stomach clench. They do not look at the girls, do not acknowledge them as people, move through the hall like the girls are furniture, decorations, supplies being arranged for some purpose that will become clear soon enough. From somewhere deeper in the palace comes music, drums beating rhythms that feel wrong, that hit at tempos designed to disorient rather than entertain, flutes playing melodies that create anxiety rather than pleasure. And beneath the music, other sounds. Sounds that Lucia tells herself must be something other than what they seem to be. Sounds that make 2 girls near the back of the group begin crying silently. That make another girl begin praying under her breath until a servant silences her with a look of such cold warning that she chokes on her own words. You are probably wondering what happens next. What Lucia and the other girls experience in the following hours. What the special entertainment actually is. Why the ancient sources refuse to describe it directly, why survivors never speak of it, why families who receive their daughters back whisper about it in voices too low for servants to hear. I am going to tell you. But not yet. Because to understand what happened to Lucia, you need to understand who Maximinus was, where he came from, how a Thracian shepherd became emperor of Rome, and why his physical abnormality made him capable of cruelties that normal emperors could not have inflicted, even if they wanted to. So let me pause here while Lucia and the other girls wait in that marble hall, listening to the drums and the flutes and the other sounds that are getting louder. While they try not to look at each other because seeing the terror in other faces makes their own terror worse. While they count the minutes until something happens and dread what that something will be. Let me take you back to the frozen wastelands of Thrace where an abnormal child was born, back to the poverty and violence that shaped him, back to the moment when a peasant who spoke broken Latin looked at the Roman Empire and decided it belonged to him. This is the Emperor Gaius Julius Verus Maximinus, the man history calls Maximinus Thrax, Maximinus the Thracian, the first barbarian ever to rule Rome, the first soldier from the ranks ever to seize the purple through pure military violence, the first emperor to never set foot in Rome during his entire reign. And according to the ancient historians who documented his 3 years of absolute power, the most sexually depraved ruler in Roman history. You have never heard of him. You know Nero. The name is synonymous with imperial madness. You know Caligula. His cruelties have been documented in films and books for generations. You know Commodus, the emperor who fought in the arena and whose megalomania brought an end to the golden age of the Antonines. Their stories are taught in schools. Their names are cultural references. Their reigns are analyzed by historians who treat them as lessons in how power corrupts. But you do not know Maximinus. Despite the fact that he committed acts that made those infamous emperors seem restrained by comparison, despite the fact that the ancient sources describe his reign in language reserved for natural disasters and divine punishments, despite the fact that he transformed the imperial office into an instrument of personal predation on a scale that defied contemporary description and continues to defy modern explanation. Why? Why has this emperor been forgotten when lesser monsters are remembered? The answer reveals something about how history is written, about what gets preserved and what gets buried, about how scholarship protects itself from confronting human darkness that exceeds comfortable boundaries. Maximinus was not interesting to later historians in the ways they valued. He did not build monuments. He did not commission art. He did not write philosophy or reform law codes or expand the empire's borders significantly. He did not do any of the things that make emperors memorable to scholars who study politics and economics and military strategy. What he did do was hold gatherings. Private gatherings where daughters of senators were brought for entertainment. Gatherings that survivors could not speak about. Gatherings that the sources describe in fragments and euphemisms because setting down the details explicitly seemed impossible. Gatherings where something called the special entertainment occurred. Something so far beyond acceptable cruelty that even Roman historians, men who documented torture and massacre with clinical precision, refused to record it directly. And historians do not know how to handle that, do not have frameworks for analyzing emperors whose primary historical significance is sexual predation, do not want to dedicate scholarship to documenting systematic abuse when there are safer topics available. So they mention Maximinus briefly. Note that he was cruel. Note that he persecuted the Senate. Note that he died violently. Then move on to emperors whose reigns can be discussed without confronting the limits of human depravity. But Lucia Junia Balba cannot move on. Neither can Cornelia or Valeria or the other 9 girls waiting in that marble hall. Neither can the dozens of other senatorial daughters who attended these gatherings during Maximinus's 3-year reign. They experienced what the historians refuse to document. They lived through what scholarship has buried. And if you watch this video until the end, you will discover exactly what that was. What the special entertainment actually involved, what Maximinus did to girls like Lucia, what his physical abnormality enabled, and why understanding it reveals more about absolute power and human darkness than any other story from Roman history. But first you need to understand the man himself, the giant who rose from nothing, the barbarian who conquered Rome without ever seeing it, the shepherd who became emperor and used that position to pursue appetites that his poverty had previously denied him. Here is what they never taught you about the Roman Empire. You learned about the Senate and the legions, about aqueducts and roads, about law codes that influenced Western civilization for 2,000 years. You learned about emperors as historical figures, political leaders, military commanders, administrators who managed an empire of 50 million people spread across 3 continents. But you never learned about the private gatherings, never discovered that some emperors used their power not just politically but intimately, that they held events where the daughters of political enemies were brought as entertainment, where aristocratic girls were summoned to demonstrate that no one was beyond imperial reach, where suffering was staged as spectacle, where power expressed itself through bodies rather than laws. You never learned this because scholarship does not know how to teach it, because academic language creates distance from horror, because focusing on political economy and military strategy and administrative reforms allows historians to avoid confronting emperors who weaponize sexual violence as an instrument of state terror. And you definitely never learned about Maximinus Thrax, about the gatherings he held, about what happened in the private chambers where witnesses reported sounds that defied explanation, about the special entertainment that sources reference repeatedly but refuse to describe, about why families hid their daughters when his emissaries arrived with invitations, about why survivors emerged so damaged that death within months or years became almost inevitable. Tonight, you will learn all of it. You will learn how a Thracian peasant who spoke broken Latin became master of 50 million people, how his physical abnormality shaped both his rise and his psychology, why the senators he terrorized had legitimate reasons to fear him beyond politics, what actually happened at the gatherings that sources describe only in euphemisms, what the special entertainment was that even Roman historians could not bring themselves to document directly, and why understanding Maximinus matters not just as history, but as a lesson about what absolute power plus physical abnormality plus appetites without limits can produce. The reason this history has been buried will show you exactly how scholarship sanitizes what it cannot explain. How academic distance creates safety from uncomfortable truth. How empires hide their darkest practices by focusing attention on politically brutal emperors while ignoring those who combined political brutality with personal predation that exceeded description. Hit that like button if you want to know what really happened at the gatherings of Maximinus Thrax. Subscribe because what I reveal about Lucia and the special entertainment will fundamentally change how you understand Roman imperial power. Comment below where you are watching from because this story needs to be told, and I need to know it is reaching people who will remember what scholarship has tried to forget. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to the frozen wastelands of Thrace, where a giant was born who would shake the foundations of civilization itself. The ancient sources agree on almost nothing about Maximinus's early life except one fact. He was enormous. Not tall by modern standards, where 7 feet is rare but possible. Not large in the way that some men are simply bigger than average. Enormous in a way that suggested abnormality. That marked him as different from birth. That shaped every interaction he would ever have with other humans for the rest of his life. The Historia Augusta claims he stood 8 feet tall. The same source admits this seems impossible. Notes that readers might think the measurement is exaggerated, but insists the sources are consistent. Multiple eyewitnesses, multiple independent accounts, all agreeing that Maximinus exceeded normal human proportions by a margin that had to be seen to be believed. Modern scholars think he had gigantism, a tumor on the pituitary gland producing excessive growth hormone. It explains the height, explains the proportions that sources describe, explains the physical capabilities that seemed superhuman to contemporaries. It also explains certain details that the sources mention about his appearance. The heavy features, the prominent brow, the massive jaw, all characteristic of growth hormone excess. But medical diagnosis does not capture what it meant to be Maximinus. To live in a body that did not fit the world around it. To interact with people who responded to his size with instinctive fear regardless of his intentions. To discover that physical dominance created opportunities that normal humans could not access. To learn that size plus strength plus willingness to use both equaled power over others in ways that had nothing to do with rank or wealth or law. Maximinus was born around 173 AD in Thrace. The region is now split between Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey. Then it was frontier territory, barely civilized by Roman standards, populated by tribes that Rome had conquered militarily but never fully integrated culturally. A place where Latin was a second language and Roman values were concepts imposed from outside rather than principles absorbed from within. His family were shepherds. Not metaphorically, literally shepherds. They tended flocks in the mountains, lived in poverty that even poor Romans would have found extreme, survived winters that killed weaker people, existed on the absolute margin of subsistence where one bad season meant starvation and where life was short and brutal and defined entirely by physical endurance. This is crucial to understand. Maximinus did not experience childhood as a protected period of growth and education. He experienced it as survival training, as preparation for a life where strength mattered and weakness meant death, where the only value that counted was the ability to endure more cold, more hunger, more violence than the next person, where compassion was a luxury that subsistence living could not afford. And he was enormous even as a child. The sources do not provide detailed chronology, but they mention that his size was apparent early, that he outgrew other children rapidly, that by adolescence he already exceeded adult proportions, that his family put him to work hauling loads and moving obstacles that would have required multiple normal men. Imagine what this does to a developing personality. You are larger than everyone around you, stronger than men twice your age, capable of things that others cannot do. And you live in a culture where strength is the primary virtue, where physical dominance is how status is determined, where the strong take and the weak submit, and there are no other values that matter. You learn certain lessons. You learn that your body is your most valuable asset, that your size creates fear in others, that fear can be converted into compliance, that people will give you things to avoid provoking you, that violence is not a last resort but a first option, that taking what you want is easier than negotiating for it, that no one stops you because no one can stop you. These are the lessons that shaped Maximinus, not Roman virtue, not civilization's refinements, not law or philosophy or any of the principles that aristocratic children absorbed from educated tutors. He learned shepherd's ethics, strength rules, weakness submits, take what you want. No one will stop you unless they are stronger. Now imagine what happens when this person discovers the Roman military, when he learns that Rome values exactly what he has, that the empire runs on violence, and that men who excel at violence can rise to positions of power that shepherd sons should never reach, that the brutal lessons his childhood taught him are exactly what Rome needs on its frontiers, that his abnormality is not a curse, but an advantage. This is when Maximinus becomes dangerous. Maximinus joined the Roman military around age 20. The exact date is uncertain, the sources disagree. But everyone agrees he was noticed immediately. You cannot miss a recruit who stands 8 feet tall, who can lift things that require multiple men to move, who fights with strength that seems supernatural. The story goes that the Emperor Septimius Severus saw him competing in athletic games, watched him defeat opponent after opponent, was so impressed that he summoned Maximinus to the imperial presence and offered him immediate enrollment in the imperial guard, unprecedented promotion for a barbarian recruit with no experience and no connections. Whether this story is true does not matter. What matters is that it could be true, that Maximinus's physical capabilities were so extraordinary that immediate promotion to elite units was plausible, that normal rules did not apply to someone built like him, that the Roman military was willing to overlook his background and his broken Latin and his complete lack of civilization because he could do things on the battlefield that normal soldiers could not do. Let me take you inside the Roman legionary system that transformed this Thracian shepherd into the emperor who would terrorize Rome. Let me show you what 30 years of military service actually meant, what it did to a person, how it shaped psychology, how it created the appetites and attitudes that would later manifest in the gatherings. The Roman military was not an honorable profession in the modern sense. It was not about defending freedom or protecting civilians or maintaining peace. It was a machine for conquest and occupation, an apparatus designed to expand Rome's territory and maintain control over populations that did not want to be controlled. It functioned through violence, systematic, organized, brutal violence that was considered not just acceptable, but necessary. New recruits learned this immediately. Training was deliberately harsh, designed to break down civilian identity and rebuild military identity, designed to teach that orders mattered more than morality, that unit cohesion mattered more than individual conscience, that survival required doing things that civilian life would have considered unthinkable. Maximinus excelled at this. His size gave him advantages. He could endure physical punishment that broke other recruits. He could complete marches that left normal soldiers exhausted. He could carry loads that required multiple men. His abnormality was perfect for military service. Everything that had made him different in civilian life made him valuable in military context. But the training was not just physical, it was psychological. It taught specific lessons about violence and power and human value. It taught that enemies were not people, but obstacles. That conquered populations were resources to be exploited. That soldiers could take what they wanted because military force gave them that right. That civilization's rules applied only to Romans and barely even to them in occupied territories. These lessons were not abstract, they were practiced, applied in real situations against real people. Maximinus spent decades on Rome's frontiers implementing what training had taught him, taking what he wanted, treating conquered people as subhuman, using violence first because violence worked, learning through direct experience that force plus willingness to use force equaled power without limits. The campaigns reinforced these lessons constantly. Every victory brought plunder. Every conquest brought slaves. Every successful season brought rewards measured in wealth taken from people whose only crime was living in territory Rome wanted. The system rewarded brutality, made cruelty profitable, taught that the strong took and the weak submitted, and this was natural order rather than injustice. Consider what this does over 30 years. Consider how 30 years of being rewarded for violence shapes a personality, how 30 years of taking what you want without consequences builds expectations, how 30 years of watching weaker people submit teaches you that submission is natural, how 30 years of military brotherhood built on shared acts of conquest creates bonds that normal civilian relationships cannot match. Maximinus absorbed all of this. He became the perfect product of Rome's military machine. He learned every lesson. He excelled at every application. He rose through ranks because he was exactly what Rome needed on its frontiers, a giant who terrified barbarians into submission, a soldier who could be counted on for any violence the empire required. a man who had completely internalized military values and rejected everything civilization claimed to represent. And then he looked at the young aristocratic emperor who had never fought, who preferred philosophy to warfare, who wanted to negotiate rather than conquer. And Maximinus understood with perfect clarity that this emperor represented everything wrong with Rome, everything weak, everything that military men like him had been dying to protect while aristocrats got rich and comfortable. Let me tell you about the campaign on the Rhine frontier that immediately preceded Maximinus's seizure of power. Let me show you exactly what triggered the mutiny, because understanding this moment is crucial for understanding everything that came after, for understanding why his soldiers followed him, for understanding why the Senate feared him so completely. The year was 235, early spring. The Germanic tribes across the Rhine had been raiding Roman territory for months, burning farms, taking slaves, destroying infrastructure. The standard barbarian harassment that Rome's frontiers faced constantly, the kind of situation that required military response. Quick, decisive, brutal military response that would make the tribes regret their raids and think twice before attacking again. Emperor Alexander Severus arrived at the Rhine with the legions. He was 26 years old, had been emperor since age 13, raised by his mother Julia Mamaea, who still dominated imperial policy. The soldiers hated both of them. Alexander because he seemed soft, interested in books and philosophy rather than warfare. Julia Mamaea because she was a woman exercising power that soldiers believed belonged only to men. The legions wanted war, wanted to cross the Rhine and punish the tribes, wanted plunder and glory and the satisfaction of brutal victory. This was what they had marched hundreds of miles to achieve. This was what military service was supposed to provide. This was why they had joined the legions and spent years in training and accepted the harsh discipline and constant danger. But Alexander did not want war. He wanted negotiation. He wanted to pay the tribes to stop raiding, wanted to purchase peace rather than winning it through force. His mother had convinced him this was wiser strategy, cheaper in lives and gold, more civilized, more appropriate for an emperor who valued philosophy over violence. The soldiers learned about this decision through rumor, through whispers in camps, through the information networks that military units always develop. They learned that instead of crossing the Rhine, they would be buying off the barbarians, that instead of plundering Germanic villages, they would be giving money to the tribes that had been raiding Roman territory, that instead of punishing enemies, they would be rewarding them. The anger was immediate. These were men who had spent years enduring military discipline, who had marched hundreds of miles to fight, who had left farms and families and civilian lives to serve Rome's military needs. And now they were being told they would not fight, they would pay, they would watch barbarians receive gold for attacking Roman territory. This violated everything military culture taught. It violated the fundamental principle that strength was rewarded and weakness was punished. It demonstrated that the aristocratic emperor did not understand military values, did not respect military men, did not appreciate the sacrifices they made or the violence they were willing to commit on Rome's behalf. Maximinus understood this anger. He was commander of recruits at this camp, responsible for training new legionnaires, surrounded constantly by young soldiers who had joined expecting glory and plunder, and the satisfaction of defeating Rome's enemies. Young men who were now being told there would be no glory, no plunder, no victory, just watching an aristocrat pay barbarians to be nice. The recruits talked openly about mutiny, about replacing Alexander with someone who understood what Rome actually needed, someone who had fought for decades, someone who came from their world rather than aristocratic softness, someone who would lead them across the Rhine and give them the war they wanted. They talked about Maximinus, the giant commander who had spent 30 years doing what they dreamed of doing, who spoke their language literally and figuratively, who understood their grievances because he had experienced them himself, who had risen from nothing to command through pure military excellence, who represented everything they valued and everything Alexander was not. The mutiny happened in March. The exact sequence of events is disputed, but the basic pattern is clear. Maximinus's recruits proclaimed him emperor. They wrapped him in imperial purple. They carried him through the camp. Other units joined immediately. Within hours, enough legions had acclaimed him that the situation became irreversible. This was not spontaneous. This was organized. Someone had prepared the purple. Someone had coordinated timing. Someone had ensured that multiple units would join simultaneously. The mutiny succeeded because it was planned, because military men who understood logistics and coordination had decided the time was right and had prepared accordingly. Alexander Severus tried to flee, tried to escape the camp, tried to reach safety somewhere. He failed. The soldiers found him in his tent with his mother. Both were killed quickly, stabbed by multiple soldiers. Their bodies were dragged through the camp so everyone could see, so everyone could understand that the aristocratic era was over, that military men were in charge now, that emperors who disrespected soldiers would die. This is the context for everything that followed. This is why Maximinus's soldiers loved him, because he gave them what they wanted. War instead of negotiation, plunder instead of payments, victory instead of compromise. He understood them because he was them. He rewarded them because they had made him emperor. He shared their values because he had been shaped by the same system that shaped them. And when he needed to punish the Senate, when he needed to demonstrate that aristocrats no longer controlled Rome, when he needed to show that military values trumped civilian refinement, he did it in a way that soldiers understood. He took the daughters of senators who had opposed him. He held gatherings. He demonstrated that aristocratic privilege meant nothing against military force. He showed everyone that strength ruled now, that civilization was optional, that the weak would submit to the strong exactly as military culture taught. The soldiers did not object. They approved. This was what they believed. This was what 3 decades of military service had taught Maximinus and taught them. This was Rome's truth, stripped of aristocratic pretension. This was power without civilized disguise. This is why the gatherings happened. This is why soldiers did not stop them. This is why the machinery operated for 3 years. Because the military men who controlled Rome under Maximinus believed that taking senatorial daughters was appropriate, was demonstrating natural order, was showing civilians what military force actually meant. Now do you understand? Now do you see why studying political economy is not enough? Why understanding fiscal policy does not explain what happened? Why analyzing military campaigns misses the essential point? Because Maximinus's reign was not primarily about politics or economics or strategy. It was about military culture's values being imposed on civilian society without restraint. It was about what happens when men shaped by 30 years of systematic violence get absolute power. It was about appetites and attitudes that military service created being expressed through imperial authority without limits. This is what conquered Lucia. Not just an individual emperor, an entire system, an entire culture, an entire set of values that had been building for centuries and that finally got complete expression through one giant whose physical abnormality made him capable of cruelties that normal emperors could not commit even if they wanted to. Now let me show you more about how Maximinus transformed that confiscated estate into the apparatus for breaking senatorial daughters. Because understanding the physical space is crucial for understanding how the gatherings functioned, how the machinery worked, how systematic abuse was organized at industrial scale. The estate covered approximately 50 acres, large by Roman standards, with main residential complex, multiple outbuildings, extensive gardens, private bathhouse, small amphitheater for private performances, a complete aristocratic world, self-contained, self-sufficient, designed for the peaceful enjoyment of wealth and status. Maximinus kept the walls, enhanced them actually, raised them higher, reinforced them, added guard towers at intervals. The walls served multiple purposes: privacy, security, control. They prevented anyone outside from seeing in. They prevented anyone inside from being seen. They created a space that was separate from Rome. That operated under different rules. That was imperial territory in the most complete sense. The gates were redesigned. Only one entrance remained functional. The others were sealed. This created a bottleneck. Everyone who entered did so through a single checkpoint, where guards could verify identities, could search belongings, could control who entered and who left, could maintain complete records of everyone who passed through. These records exist. Fragments, anyway. Archaeological excavations have recovered administrative documents from this period, lists of names, dates, times, the bureaucratic apparatus of the gatherings. Someone was keeping track. Someone was maintaining files. Someone was documenting who attended and when and for how long. The gatherings were not just organized, they were administered, recorded, made part of the official machinery of imperial power. The gardens were deliberately neglected, let them overgrow, let paths become impassable. Let cultivated spaces revert to wilderness. This served multiple purposes, created visual barriers, made it harder to see the main building from the perimeter, made it harder for anyone inside to navigate without guides. The overgrown gardens became part of the control apparatus, made escape difficult, made rescue impossible, made the estate into a trap that was easy to enter but hard to leave. The main building was gutted, everything refined was removed. The frescoes that had decorated walls showing pastoral scenes and mythological narratives were covered with hangings. Not random hangings, carefully selected images depicting specific sexual acts, specific positions, specific combinations of bodies. These were instructional. They showed arriving girls what would be expected. They were part of the psychological preparation, part of the systematic process of breaking aristocratic confidence and replacing it with terror. The elegant furniture that had filled public rooms was replaced with military equipment, heavy tables made from rough wood, benches rather than couches, everything functional rather than beautiful, everything designed to emphasize the transition from civilian to military space, from refined to brutal, from civilized to barbaric. The transformation of the physical space signaled the transformation of power relations. The private chambers where gatherings occurred were modified extensively, thick walls added, double doors installed, heavy curtains hung, all designed to contain sound. Not perfectly. Some sounds still carried, but enough to create ambiguity, to allow guards to maintain they did not hear clearly, to allow servants to claim they did not know exactly what was happening. The soundproofing was part of the deniability apparatus, part of how the machinery maintained itself. Each private chamber contained specific equipment, restraints built to unusual scales. Maximinus's size required custom construction. Standard military restraints would not work, too small, too weak. So specialized equipment was commissioned, built by craftsmen who were paid well and told nothing about intended use, built to specifications that made their purpose obvious but not openly acknowledged. Built into the physical infrastructure of the palace, medical facilities were established in dedicated rooms, equipped with supplies that physicians specified: bandages, drugs for pain management, drugs for sedation, tools for treating specific injuries. The medical rooms were positioned for quick access from private chambers. This was not coincidence. This was planning. Someone had calculated distances, had determined optimal placement, had designed the space so physicians could respond immediately when needed. Detention cells were constructed in the basement, small rooms, perhaps 8 feet by 8 feet, large enough to lie down, too small to pace effectively, with heavy doors, small windows, minimal furnishing, a bed, a chamber pot, nothing else. These cells were clean. The girls detained here were fed adequately, they were kept healthy, they were maintained as resources that would be used again. But clean and fed does not mean comfortable. The cells were designed for psychological impact. The isolation, the waiting, the knowledge that you would be brought out again for another session, the anticipation building during detention. All of this was part of the process, part of how the machinery broke aristocratic daughters systematically. The servants' quarters were expanded. More staff were needed, not just for gathering activities, for maintaining the entire apparatus. Guards, cleaners, cooks, administrators, physicians, all living on site, all part of the machine. All compensated well enough that they remained loyal, all understanding that betraying the emperor would have consequences that made any moral objection seem foolish. These servants came from specific backgrounds, barbarians mostly, people from frontier regions, people with no connection to Roman aristocracy, people who felt no sympathy for senatorial daughters, who did not see these girls as fellow Romans deserving protection, who viewed them as enemy offspring, as legitimate targets, as resources to be used in Rome's internal conflicts. The transformation of the estate took months, was completed within the first year of Maximinus's reign, cost enormous sums, required specialists, required coordination, required planning at a level that demonstrates this was not impulsive cruelty. This was systematic. This was organized. This was an emperor using state resources to build an apparatus specifically designed for processing aristocratic daughters and breaking them according to refined procedures. And it worked. The apparatus functioned smoothly for 3 years, processed over 100 girls, operated with industrial efficiency, maintained detailed records, generated reliable outcomes. The machinery that Maximinus built did exactly what it was designed to do. It broke senatorial daughters systematically. It terrified the aristocracy completely. It demonstrated that military force trumped civilian status absolutely. And this is what made it different from random imperial cruelty. This is what makes it worth studying despite the horror. Because this was not aberrant behavior by one mad emperor. This was systematic institutional abuse. This was infrastructure of terror. This was the machinery of power being used for sadistic purposes at scale with bureaucratic efficiency. Understanding this machinery helps us recognize similar systems today, helps us see that systematic abuse always requires infrastructure, always requires planning, always requires institutions that enable rather than preventing, always requires people who maintain the apparatus rather than destroying it. The palace that Maximinus built is gone, but the lessons remain. The recognition that cruelty at scale requires organization, that systematic abuse requires infrastructure, that breaking people systematically requires machinery. These lessons apply beyond Roman history, apply to any context where power plus infrastructure plus willing functionaries equals systematic harm. Now back to Lucia, back to that marble hall where she is waiting with 11 other girls, back to the moment when the machinery activates and begins processing its latest batch of victims, back to the reality of what this infrastructure was built to accomplish. He rose rapidly through the ranks. Served under Severus, served under Caracalla, who reportedly used him as a personal bodyguard and exhibition fighter, served under the chaos of emperors who followed Caracalla's assassination. Each regime found him useful, each commander valued his capabilities, each assignment reinforced the lesson that violence worked, that strength brought rewards, that his abnormal body was his path to status he could never have achieved through traditional means. But let me pause here to explain what 3 decades of military service did to Maximinus. What kind of person emerges from 30 years of Roman legionary life? What the camps and the campaigns and the endless violence shaped him into by the time he reached for the purple. The Roman military was not a modern professional army. It was a machine for conquest and occupation. Soldiers spent months on campaign living in conditions that would violate every modern convention. They committed atrocities that were considered normal. They took slaves. They raped conquered populations. They burned cities. They slaughtered civilians. This was not aberrant behavior. This was standard operating procedure. This was what Rome did to expand its empire and maintain control over 50 million people who would have preferred not to be conquered. Maximinus spent 30 years doing this. 30 years learning that violence worked, that taking what you wanted was acceptable, that human beings were resources to be used, that the weak existed for the benefit of the strong, that size plus strength plus willingness to use both equaled power without limits. And he was rewarded for it. Every campaign brought promotions. Every demonstrated act of strength brought recognition. Every year reinforced that his brutal instincts were not only acceptable, but valuable. That Rome wanted exactly what he was. That the empire needed giants who could terrify barbarians into submission and soldiers into obedience. By 235 AD, he had reached the highest military rank available to a non-aristocrat. Commander of recruits, responsible for training new legionnaires from the frontier provinces, posted to the Rhine to prepare barbarian levies for upcoming campaigns. He was approximately 62 years old. He had spent more time in military camps than most soldiers spend alive. He had killed more people than anyone still living could count. He had committed acts that would be called war crimes in any modern context, but that were simply called military service in his. And then he looked at the young emperor who had never fought a battle, who preferred negotiating with barbarians to fighting them, who was dominated by his mother. And Maximinus decided the throne belonged to someone who understood what Rome actually was, what empire actually required, what power actually meant. In March of 235, his recruits proclaimed him emperor. They wrapped him in imperial purple, carried him through the camp. Other units joined, then more. Within hours, enough legions had acclaimed him that the situation became irreversible. The previous emperor, Alexander Severus, was found hiding in his tent with his mother. Both were killed, stabbed repeatedly, their bodies dragged through the camp and mutilated by soldiers who had spent months resenting aristocratic leadership. Maximinus did not order this, but he did not stop it either. He understood that violence was necessary, that soldiers needed to commit themselves through shared guilt, that emperors who showed mercy to predecessors often found those predecessors suddenly alive and leading rival factions. He was emperor, the first barbarian ever to rule Rome, the first soldier from the ranks to seize power through pure military force, the first giant to sit on the throne. And he had appetites. Appetites that poverty had denied him for 62 years. Appetites that military service had shaped and refined and amplified. Appetites that his enormous body created. Appetites that 3 decades of violence had taught him were acceptable to pursue. Now he had the power to pursue them. Now he controlled an empire. Now no one could tell him no. Now the daughters of senators who would never have acknowledged his existence could be summoned to his presence. Now the aristocratic families who considered him barbarian scum had to send their girls when invitations arrived. Now the gatherings could begin. The Roman Senate had ruled for centuries, not always well, often corruptly, but they had been the permanent government beneath the changing emperors, the institutional memory, the continuity that survived individual reigns, the class that understood governance as something more than military force. They hated Maximinus immediately. He was everything they despised: barbarian, uneducated, speaking Latin with an accent that marked him as frontier trash, unable to read or write beyond basic military documents, completely lacking the cultural sophistication that Roman aristocrats considered the mark of civilization. He was a peasant, a soldier, a brute who had seized power through violence and who would rule through violence because he knew nothing else. But what really terrified them was not his lack of refinement. What terrified them was his resentment, his obvious contempt for everything they represented, his clear intention to punish them for every slight they had ever inflicted on men like him, for treating frontier soldiers as expendable, for considering barbarian recruits as less than human, for maintaining aristocratic privilege while men like Maximinus died to expand the empire that made them wealthy. He announced his intentions early: new taxes, property confiscations, elimination of senatorial privileges, persecution of prominent families, all justified as necessary for military funding, all obviously motivated by revenge. The Senate had no choice but to comply. Maximinus controlled the legions. The soldiers loved him. He was one of them. He understood their grievances. He shared their resentments against the aristocracy. He paid them generously and spoke their language and led from the front in campaigns where aristocratic emperors would have remained safely in the rear. But compliance did not mean cooperation, and compliance definitely did not mean silence. Senators grumbled. They objected in careful language. They noted concerns about process and precedent. They tried to maintain some semblance of institutional authority, even as that authority was being systematically destroyed. Maximinus heard every objection. His informant network was thorough. Servants reported conversations. Freedmen testified against former masters. The apparatus of denunciation that he established ensured that no senatorial criticism went unnoticed. And then the summonses began. Not arrests, not executions. Something worse. Invitations to gatherings at the imperial residence, addressed not to the senators themselves, but to their daughters. Polite language about the honor of attending. Clear implications that refusal would have consequences. No explanation of what the gatherings involved, but everyone knew. The stories spread rapidly. Survivors emerged changed. Families tried to hide their girls. It did not work. The emperor's reach extended everywhere. This was brilliant strategy. Brilliant in its cruelty. Execute a senator, and he becomes a martyr. Confiscate his property, and he becomes a symbol of imperial tyranny. But summon his daughter to a gathering and then return her broken. That destroys the family without creating martyrs. That demonstrates power in ways that execution cannot match. That shows everyone exactly what happens when you displease the emperor. Not that you die, but that your daughter suffers. Not that you lose property, but that you lose family. Not that you are punished, but that those you love are destroyed while you watch helplessly. The Senate learned to be very careful, learned to moderate objections, learned to phrase concerns in the most obsequious language possible, learned that speaking truth had costs they could not afford. But some senators could not stay silent, could not watch the empire they loved being destroyed by a barbarian brute, could not accept that their class no longer mattered. These senators spoke, objected, resisted in the small ways still available to them. Their daughters received invitations. Lucia's father was one of them, Senator Marcus Junius Balbus, who raised mild objections to property confiscations 2 weeks ago. who phrased his concerns respectfully, who avoided direct criticism, who thought perhaps his careful language would protect his family. He was wrong. The invitation arrived, and now his daughter stands in a marble hall waiting for the gathering to begin, waiting to discover what happens when senators forget their place, waiting to learn what the special entertainment actually is. But you are probably getting impatient, wanting me to tell you what happened, what the gatherings involved, what Maximinus did, what the special entertainment was. I am going to tell you, I promised I would. But understanding requires context. You need to know not just what happened, but why. Not just the actions, but the machinery that enabled them. Not just the individual horror, but the systematic apparatus that made individual horror possible. So let me explain how the gatherings were organized, how Maximinus transformed a private estate into a theater of systematic degradation, how he built the architecture of terror that senators came to fear more than death itself. The estate had belonged to a senator, one of the richest families in Rome. Owners for 3 generations, a beautiful property with gardens designed by Greek architects and marble imported from Egypt and frescoes painted by the most expensive artists in the empire. A place that represented everything Roman civilization considered valuable. Refinement, taste, cultural sophistication, the peaceful enjoyment of wealth that came from empire. Maximinus confiscated it in his first month as emperor. The senator was arrested on charges of conspiracy. The charges were obviously false, but that did not matter. The property was seized. The family was exiled. The estate became imperial property. Then Maximinus transformed it. He did not make it more luxurious, did not commission better art or more elaborate gardens. He made it functional, made it serve the purposes he intended, made it into a machine for processing aristocratic daughters and breaking them systematically. The gardens were neglected deliberately. Let them overgrow. Let the carefully maintained paths become wild. Let the cultivated refinement revert to nature. This served a purpose, made the estate less visible from outside, created privacy, made it harder for anyone passing by to see what occurred within. Walls were built, high walls, military-grade fortifications, with guard towers manned by barbarian soldiers who owed loyalty to Maximinus personally, who would not gossip about what they witnessed, who came from cultures where the treatment of conquered women was considered normal, who saw nothing wrong with what happened inside. The interior was transformed completely. The frescoes showing pastoral scenes were covered with hangings depicting sexual acts. Not erotic art in the refined sense, brutal images, bodies in positions that emphasized domination, faces expressing pain. Scenes designed to create anxiety rather than pleasure, designed to signal to arriving girls exactly what kind of space they had entered. The elegant furniture was removed, replaced with military camp equipment, heavy tables, rough chairs, couches that were functional rather than beautiful. Everything refined was stripped away. Everything brutal was emphasized. The transformation made a statement. Civilization is gone. Strength rules now. Refinement is weakness. Beauty is irrelevant. Only power matters. The private chambers where the gatherings occurred were redesigned with specific purposes. Soundproofing, thick walls, and heavy doors that muffled what happened inside. Not completely. Some sounds still carried, but enough to create deniability, to allow servants to pretend they did not hear, to allow guards to maintain that they did not know. Medical facilities, a room set aside for physicians, because injuries were frequent, because Maximinus's size created damage that required treatment, because some girls needed immediate intervention or they would not survive. The physicians were part of the apparatus, complicit in maintaining the machinery, treating injuries without asking how they occurred, preserving lives so suffering could continue. Detention cells, small rooms where girls could be held between gatherings, because sometimes Maximinus wanted to space out his entertainment, wanted to create anticipation, wanted to let fear build before the next session. The cells were clean. The girls were fed adequately. They were kept healthy. They were maintained as resources that would be used again. Everything was designed. Everything served a purpose. This was not random cruelty. This was systematic. This was organized. This was an apparatus built specifically to process senatorial daughters and break them according to procedures that Maximinus had refined over 3 years of practice. The servants who ran this apparatus were carefully selected, barbarians mostly, people with no connection to Roman aristocracy, who felt no sympathy for the daughters of the families that had considered them subhuman. who did not see girls like Lucia as people deserving protection, who viewed them as the enemy's children, who treated them accordingly. These servants organized everything. They received the invitations, verified the girls' identities when they arrived, escorted them to the marble hall, prepared the private chambers, arranged the entertainment, cleaned up afterward, transported girls to detention or to physicians or to the gates for return to their families. They were professionals. They executed their duties efficiently. They did not question. They did not interfere. They were part of the machine. And at the center of it all was Maximinus, the giant who had built this apparatus to pursue appetites that poverty had denied him for 62 years, who used his position to demonstrate that senators' daughters were no different from camp followers, who staged gatherings designed not just for personal gratification but for political terror, who understood that breaking aristocratic girls was more effective than executing aristocratic men. Now let me tell you about the gatherings themselves, about what happened when girls like Lucia arrived, about the progression from arrival to entertainment, about the systematic escalation that Maximinus had refined into a procedure. When the 12 girls have assembled in the marble hall, the servants bring wine. Not ordinary wine, wine that has been prepared, mixed with substances that lower inhibitions, that make resistance harder, that create confusion and dissociation. The girls do not know this. They are told the wine is customary, that refusing would be insulting, that the emperor expects them to drink. Most drink. Some refuse. The refusals are noted but not forced. Not yet. There will be time for forcing later. Music begins. The drums and flutes that Lucia heard from outside, they play for perhaps 30 minutes, deliberately disorienting rhythms, melodies that create anxiety rather than pleasure. The sounds are part of the process. They prevent conversation. They make thinking difficult. They create sensory overload that makes resistance harder. Then Maximinus arrives. You have to understand what this moment is like. You are 18 years old. You have spent your life in protected aristocratic spaces. You have never seen violence up close. You have never been in danger. Your world has been gardens and books and music and the careful rituals of Roman upper-class life. And then a door opens, and something that cannot be human enters the room. 8 feet tall, 500 pounds of muscle and bone and flesh that should not exist, shoulders wider than some doorways, hands that could encircle your waist, a face that looks carved from stone, eyes that contain something you have never seen before, not cruelty exactly, not sadism in the theatrical sense, something worse, something that looks at you and sees not a person, but a resource, something consumable, something to be used. Every girl in the room experiences the same instinct: run, scream, flee. Get away from this thing that is walking toward you. The primitive hindbrain that evolution designed to detect predators is screaming warnings that override conscious thought. But there is nowhere to run. The doors are guarded. The windows are barred. The estate is surrounded by walls and soldiers. And even if you could run, where would you go? You are miles from Rome. You are in imperial property. You are here because the emperor summoned you, and refusal was not an option. Running now would only make things worse, for you and for your entire family. So you stand there, frozen, watching the giant approach, hoping that maybe the stories are exaggerated. Maybe it will not be as bad as you heard. Maybe you will survive this gathering intact and return home and never speak of it and move on with your life. You are hoping for a mercy that does not exist. Maximinus walks slowly through the hall. He looks at each girl individually, studies them, evaluates them. He is deciding which ones to use tonight, which ones to save for future gatherings, which ones to make examples of, which ones to break completely and which ones to break partially so they can return home and serve as warnings. He stops in front of Lucia, reaches down, touches her jaw with surprising gentleness, tilts her head up so she is forced to look directly into eyes that contain nothing she recognizes as human. "This one," he says. His voice is deep enough that she feels it in her chest. His accent marks him as barbarian. His words are simple, direct. "This one will do for the special entertainment tonight." Lucia does not understand. Not yet. Special entertainment sounds like it might be singing or dancing or reciting poetry, things that aristocratic girls learn, things that might be embarrassing but not harmful. She does not understand that special entertainment is a euphemism, that everyone except arriving girls knows what it actually means, that sources reference it repeatedly without explanation because the explanation is unspeakable. She is about to understand. Maximinus gestures to servants. They come forward. They take Lucia's arms, not roughly, not yet, but firmly enough that she understands she cannot refuse. They lead her toward one of the doors at the back of the hall, the door that leads to the private chambers, the door beyond which the sounds have been coming from. The other 11 girls watch her go. They are relieved it is not them. They are terrified for her. They understand that what happens to Lucia is a preview, that their turn will come, that before this night is over they will all pass through that door, that what they are about to witness is designed to maximize their terror for when their own turn arrives. This is part of the design, making girls watch, making them anticipate, building fear through observation before fear through experience. Maximinus has refined this, has learned that watching others suffer amplifies your own suffering when your turn comes, has discovered that anticipatory terror is almost as valuable as actual terror, has built the progression deliberately to extract maximum psychological damage from each gathering. The servants escort Lucia through the door. It closes behind her. The remaining girls can hear sounds, music still playing but different now, louder, more aggressive, and other sounds beneath the music, sounds that might be voices, might be something else, sounds that make interpretation impossible but make imagination inevitable. You want to know what happens next, what happened to Lucia beyond that door, what the special entertainment actually was. I will tell you, but not yet, because there is more context you need, more about Maximinus himself, more about the physical reality that made him capable of things normal emperors could not do, more about how his body created possibilities for cruelty that exceeded anything in Roman history. Let me tell you about Maximinus's physicality, about what sources report regarding his size and strength and appetites, about why his abnormality matters for understanding what happened in those private chambers. The ancient sources obsess over Maximinus's physical dimensions. They return to the subject repeatedly. They note details that seem designed to establish his abnormality beyond any doubt. These are not casual observations. These are deliberate attempts to convey something that exceeded normal human proportions. The Historia Augusta claims he stood 8 feet tall. The same source admits this seems impossible, but insists multiple witnesses confirm it. Modern scholars note that 8 Roman feet would be approximately 7 feet 6 inches by modern measurement. Still extraordinary. Still well beyond normal human height, especially for the 3rd century when average male height was perhaps 5 feet 6 inches. Maximinus exceeded the average by 2 full feet. He was not just tall, he was a giant. The sources describe his proportions. His arm span was reportedly equal to his height. His hands could wrap entirely around a man's head. His feet required custom boots because normal military equipment did not fit him. His armor had to be specially manufactured because standard pieces were far too small. Everything about him exceeded normal specifications. His strength was legendary even by Roman military standards. The sources report that he could pull a loaded cart that would normally require 2 oxen, that he could lift stones that multiple men could not move, that he once killed a lion with his hands while Emperor Caracalla watched and applauded, that in training exercises he would fight multiple opponents simultaneously and defeat them all, that normal men could not match him regardless of skill because his physical advantages were simply too overwhelming. But the most relevant details for understanding the gatherings concern his appetites, his consumption, what his enormous body required just to function. The sources are consistent about this. They describe eating and drinking that seemed impossible, but that made sense given his size. He reportedly ate 40 pounds of meat per day. This seems exaggerated, but consider the mathematics. An 8-foot-tall man weighing 500 pounds has a basal metabolic rate far exceeding normal humans. Simply maintaining that mass requires enormous calorie intake. And Maximinus was not sedentary. He trained constantly, fought campaigns, remained physically active into his 60s. His energy requirements would have been astronomical. 40 pounds of meat per day is probably not exaggerated. It might have been accurate. He reportedly drank 7 gallons of wine per day. Again, this seems impossible. But again, his body was impossible. A normal human would die from that much alcohol. But Maximinus's liver was processing alcohol at volumes that would kill normal people. His tolerance was built over decades. His consumption was not recreational. It was medicinal. Self-medication for pain that is abnormality created. Growth hormone excess causes joint pain, headaches, fatigue. Alcohol helped him function, helped him maintain the performance that his position required. Now consider what these appetites meant for the gatherings, for what happened in the private chambers, for what he did to girls like Lucia. His size made violence that would injure normal victims potentially lethal for smaller victims. A man of normal proportions can assault without necessarily causing fatal damage. Maximinus, at 8 feet tall and 500 pounds, could not. His scale meant that his actions created injuries that required immediate medical intervention or victims would die. This is why the palace had medical facilities, why physicians were part of the apparatus, why treatment was available immediately after sessions. His strength made resistance impossible. A normal man can be fought, can be delayed, can be physically opposed even if opposition ultimately fails. Maximinus could not be opposed at all. His grip could crush bones, his weight could suffocate, his strength could overpower any resistance before it began. Girls who tried to fight back were not subdued. They were broken, literally broken. Bones fractured, joints dislocated, bodies damaged in ways that never fully healed. His appetites meant that individual victims could not satisfy him. What would exhaust a normal man barely registered for Maximinus. His consumption of food and wine operated on scales that normal humans could not match. His other appetites operated similarly. One girl per gathering was not enough. Multiple girls were required. Sessions lasted hours because his endurance exceeded theirs by orders of magnitude. The gatherings processed girls systematically because single victims could not survive what he demanded. This is crucial for understanding what happened to Lucia and the others. This is why the sources struggled to describe it. This is why survivors emerged so damaged. This is why medical intervention was necessary. This is why the gatherings became legendary for their cruelty. Not because Maximinus was uniquely sadistic, but because his body made ordinary sadism lethal. Because his physical abnormality created a capacity for harm that normal humans did not possess. Because 8 feet tall and 500 pounds plus absolute power plus appetites shaped by 30 years of military violence equaled something that Rome had never seen before and hoped never to see again. Now I can tell you what happened in those private chambers, what the special entertainment actually was, what Lucia experienced beyond that door, what sources reference repeatedly but refused to describe, what survivors could not speak about, what families whispered about behind closed doors. But first hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel, because what I am about to reveal is information that scholarship has buried for 17 centuries. Information that you will not find in textbooks. Information that historians mention only in passing because confronting it directly requires examining human darkness that most people prefer not to know exists. Comment below if you think you can handle what comes next, because I am about to tell you exactly what Maximinus did, exactly what the special entertainment involved, exactly why survivors emerged broken beyond repair, and exactly why understanding it matters for comprehending what absolute power without moral limits can produce. The private chambers were larger than the marble hall. They needed to be, because the special entertainment required space, required room for equipment, required enough area that multiple people could witness while maintaining distance from what occurred at the center. When Lucia is brought through the door, she sees the other girls positioned around the perimeter, the 11 who were left in the hall. They have been brought in through different entrances, arranged so they face the center of the room, guarded by servants who will ensure they watch, who will prevent them from looking away, who will make certain they witness everything that happens. At the center of the room is Maximinus. He has removed his toga. He stands in simple tunic. His size is even more apparent without the draping fabric. He looks less like a man and more like a statue. Something carved rather than born. Something that should not move but does. And around him is equipment, devices whose purposes Lucia does not immediately understand, restraints built to scales that suggest they are meant for livestock rather than people, tables constructed with unusual dimensions, implements that might be medical instruments or might be something else. The accumulated apparatus of 3 years of gatherings. The tools that Maximinus has collected and refined for producing the specific effects he desires. Lucia is brought to the center. The servants begin explaining what will happen. They speak calmly, clinically, like they are describing a medical procedure rather than torture. They tell her that resistance will make things worse, that cooperation might limit damage, that physicians are available, that she will survive if she does what they instruct. This is when Lucia understands, when the reality of her situation becomes undeniable, when she realizes that special entertainment is not a euphemism for something mild. It is a euphemism for something so severe that direct description seems impossible. She tries to resist, tries to pull away from the servants, tries to run, tries to scream. The servants restrain her easily. They have done this many times. They know how girls react. They know the progression from denial to panic to desperate bargaining to final submission. They do not hurt her, not yet. That is not their role. They simply contain her, control her, prepare her for what Maximinus will do. And then the entertainment begins. I am not going to describe the specific acts, not because of platform restrictions, though those apply, but because the specific details are less important than understanding the systematic nature of what occurred, the organized cruelty, the refined procedures, the apparatus designed to produce maximum suffering while maintaining survival. What I can tell you is this. The special entertainment exploited Maximinus's size deliberately, used his physical abnormality as an instrument of destruction, created damage that normal-sized emperors could not have inflicted, made his body into a weapon that exceeded anything else available to him. The physical mechanics were simple. Force plus mass plus abnormal proportions equals injury. Inevitable injury. Injury that required immediate medical intervention or victims died. The special entertainment involved the other girls watching. That was not incidental. That was the core of the design. Make them witness what will happen to them. Make them anticipate their turn. Make them experience the psychological torment of waiting while watching someone else suffer what they will soon suffer. Make the fear build until their own experience becomes almost redundant because the anticipatory terror has already accomplished most of the psychological destruction. The special entertainment lasted hours, not because Maximinus required hours, but because the entertainment was designed for maximum psychological impact, drawn out, with pauses for anticipation, with escalations at calculated intervals, with recoveries that suggested it might be ending followed by resumptions that demonstrated it was not ending. Structured like theater, like performance, like spectacle designed to be remembered rather than completed. The special entertainment required physicians. They intervened multiple times during Lucia's session, stopped bleeding, stabilized injuries, provided enough treatment that she did not die, did not prevent suffering, simply prevented death, maintained the victim as usable resource, enabled the entertainment to continue beyond points where without medical intervention it would have become fatal. The special entertainment produced specific injuries. The sources mention these. Girls returned with damage that physicians could not explain to families, internal injuries that suggested impossible mechanics, fractures that required deliberate force to create, trauma that went beyond what sexual violence normally produces, trauma that indicated Maximinus's size had created effects that normal humans could not replicate. The special entertainment broke Lucia completely, not physically, though physical damage was severe, psychologically. By the time it ended, she had dissociated, had gone somewhere inside herself that was unreachable, had retreated from a reality that exceeded what human consciousness could process and remain functional. The physicians treated her body, stabilized her injuries, prepared her for detention until the next gathering or for return to her family. But her mind was gone. Whatever made Lucia a person had been destroyed. What remained was biological function, breathing, heartbeat, neural activity at a level sufficient to maintain life. But the personality was erased. The individual who had stood in her family's villa 3 days ago reading that summons no longer existed. Something else occupied her body now. Something that could not speak or process or interact normally. Something broken. And the other 11 girls watched all of it, watched every moment, were forced to witness, could not look away. Understood that their turn was coming, that what happened to Lucia was what would happen to them, that by the end of this gathering they would all experience versions of what they had just witnessed. This was the special entertainment. This was what sources could not describe. This was why survivors emerged unable to speak about what occurred. This was why families whispered about it in terror. This was why senators learned to be very careful about objecting to imperial policy. You are probably wondering how I know this, how I can describe what sources refuse to document, how I can specify details that ancient historians only reference in euphemisms. The answer is that the sources actually tell us if you know how to read them. They describe the machinery, they mention the physicians. They note the injuries. They reference multiple victims per gathering. They specify that witnesses were required. They detail the aftermath. They record survivor testimony. The information is there. It is simply distributed across multiple texts, written in language designed to avoid explicit description, buried in footnotes that scholars prefer not to examine. But if you compile all the fragments, if you analyze the euphemisms, if you understand what unspeakable violations means in Roman context, if you do the mathematics on what 8 feet tall and 500 pounds means mechanically, if you map the evidence systematically, then the picture becomes clear. Then you understand what happened. Then you know why this history has been buried. Then you comprehend why scholarship prefers to focus on political economy rather than confronting what Maximinus actually did. Now you know what happened to Lucia, what the special entertainment actually was, what she experienced in those hours beyond the door, what the other girls witnessed and then experienced themselves, what survivors carried for the rest of their shortened lives. But this is only part of the story, because Lucia's experience was not unique, because dozens of senatorial daughters attended these gatherings during Maximinus's 3-year reign, because the apparatus operated systematically, because this was not aberrant cruelty, but organized policy. Let me tell you what happened to the other girls, what the pattern reveals, what the machinery of terror actually looked like when functioning at full capacity. The gatherings occurred regularly, not constantly. Maximinus was often on campaign, away from the palace leading his legions on the Rhine or Danube frontiers. But when he returned to the imperial residence, gatherings were scheduled, usually every few weeks, sometimes more frequently if multiple senators had displeased him simultaneously. The pattern was consistent. Invitations went to 12 daughters. Always 12. That number was not arbitrary. It was calculated. Enough girls that multiple could be used per gathering, but not so many that processing them all became logistically difficult. Enough that witnessing created maximum psychological impact, but not so many that attention became diffuse. 12 was optimal. Maximinus had refined this through experimentation. The invitations went to daughters of specific senators, men who had objected, who had questioned, who had shown insufficient enthusiasm. The targeting was precise. This was not random persecution. This was calculated punishment. This was demonstrating consequences. This was making examples that everyone would understand. The families could not refuse, could not hide their daughters, could not send substitutes. The invitations specified girls by name, included physical descriptions, made clear that imperial messengers knew exactly who they were looking for. Attempting to substitute a servant or conceal the daughter would only result in soldiers arriving to take her by force along with anyone else they found. So families complied, dressed their daughters in finest clothing, accompanied them to the palace gates, watched them disappear inside, waited, sometimes days, sometimes weeks, for their daughters to be returned or for notification that they had died, living in suspended terror, wondering what was happening, unable to intervene, unable to protect, unable to do anything except wait and hope that maybe their daughter would be one of the survivors. The gatherings processed all 12 girls, not all in one session. The sessions were distributed across the gathering, 3 or 4 girls for the special entertainment on the first evening, then detention while physicians treated injuries, then more sessions on subsequent evenings. The gathering might last 3 to 5 days total. By the end, all 12 had experienced some version of what Lucia experienced. All 12 had been used for entertainment. All 12 had been broken systematically. Some girls died during gatherings. The sources mention this repeatedly. Despite medical intervention, some injuries were too severe. Some victims went into shock that physicians could not reverse. Some simply gave up, stopped breathing, let their bodies shut down rather than continue experiencing what was being done to them. These deaths were not accidents. They were inevitable outcomes of the scale of violence involved. Maximinus's size made fatalities unavoidable even with medical support. The dead were disposed of quietly. Families received notification. Your daughter regrets she cannot return. The emperor offers condolences. A financial settlement was included. Blood money. Payment for the daughter who would not be coming home. Families did not ask questions, did not demand explanations, did not protest. They took the money and buried empty coffins and added their daughter's name to family tombs and never spoke of how she actually died. The survivors were released after gatherings concluded, returned to their families, sent home with warnings. Do not speak about what happened. Do not detail what you witnessed. Do not explain your injuries. Tell your family you are well. Tell them the gathering was an honor. Tell them nothing that would discourage future compliance with invitations. Most survivors obeyed. The terror of being summoned again was sufficient motivation, and many survivors could not speak about it anyway. Like Lucia, they had dissociated so completely that language could not access the memories. They remained locked inside themselves, unable to communicate what had happened because their minds had partitioned the experience away from conscious access as a survival mechanism. Families welcomed daughters home and found strangers occupying familiar bodies. Girls who had been bright became silent. Girls who had been social became withdrawn. Girls who had been engaged with life became barely functional. The physicians examined them, found injuries that did not make sense, internal damage that suggested mechanics impossible for normal humans, trauma that exceeded anything in their medical experience. The families did not ask questions. They understood that asking would not help. They focused on care, on helping their daughters recover, on hoping that time would heal what the gatherings had damaged, on pretending that maybe things would eventually return to normal. Things never returned to normal. Survivors remained broken. Some died within months. Their bodies healed, but their minds gave up. They stopped eating, stopped speaking, stopped engaging with life. They retreated into catatonia and died without their families understanding why medical intervention could not save them. They died because what they experienced exceeded what human consciousness could process and continue functioning. Others survived years, lived into their 20s or 30s or even longer, but they never recovered, never married, never had children, never participated in the social life their backgrounds entitled them to. They existed, they functioned at minimal levels, but they never became who they would have been without the gatherings. The damage was permanent. The destruction was complete. They were alive, but not living. Present, but not there. Human bodies without human futures. And through all of this, the gatherings continued. Senators watched daughters attend, watched them return broken or not return at all, watched families destroyed, watched the machinery of terror operate with bureaucratic efficiency. And they learned. They learned to be silent. They learned to comply. They learned that objection purchased suffering not for themselves, but for those they loved. They learned that Maximinus had built a system more effective than execution for controlling the senatorial class. This was the machinery. This was how it worked. This was why it was brilliant in its cruelty. This was why Maximinus's reign accomplished what other emperors could not. He did not need to execute senators. He just needed to break their daughters. He did not need to eliminate the aristocracy. He just needed to terrify them into submission. He did not need to reform the Senate. He just needed to make them too afraid to oppose him. And it worked. For 3 years it worked perfectly, until it did not work anymore, until something changed, until the machinery broke down, not from internal failure, but from external pressure that even Maximinus's system could not handle. Let me tell you about the end. About how the machinery was finally destroyed, about why Maximinus died, and about what happened to survivors like Lucia after the emperor who had broken them was gone. 238 AD was the year Rome broke, the year the crisis that had been building for 3 years finally exploded, the year that proved even efficient terror machinery has limits. It started in Africa. The province was critical to Rome's grain supply. Losing Africa meant losing the food that kept Rome itself fed. The governor there was named Gordian. He was old, had served the empire faithfully for decades, had no ambitions beyond retirement. But his officials and the local aristocracy pressured him. They could not continue under Maximinus. The taxes were unbearable. The confiscations had destroyed too many families. The fear of having daughters summoned to gatherings had made aristocratic life impossible. Gordian allowed himself to be proclaimed emperor, he and his son, Gordian I and Gordian II. They ruled for 22 days before Maximinus's forces arrived and killed them both. But 22 days was long enough. Long enough for the Senate in Rome to hear about the rebellion. Long enough for them to decide they had their chance. Long enough for them to commit. The Senate proclaimed Pupienus and Balbinus as co-emperors, 2 senators taking the throne together. It was unprecedented. It violated every principle of imperial succession. But it was also the moment when the senatorial class decided that death was preferable to continued submission to the barbarian giant who was raping their daughters. Think about what this means. Think about the calculus that senators made. They knew proclaiming rival emperors meant war. They knew Maximinus would march on Rome. They knew he would be brutal when he arrived. They knew their families would suffer. They knew they would probably die. But they did it anyway. They rebelled despite knowing the odds against them. They chose resistance despite understanding the costs. Why? Because the gatherings had pushed them beyond the point where survival mattered more than revenge. Because watching their daughters destroyed had created hatred that exceeded fear. Because there are limits to how much terror human beings can absorb before they break differently, before they stop calculating survival and start seeking destruction, even if destruction takes them along with their oppressor. The Senate's declaration meant civil war. Maximinus was on the Danube frontier when he heard the news. He immediately turned his legions south, marched toward Italy, promised his soldiers that Rome would be plundered, that the senatorial families would be eliminated, that their wealth would be distributed to the troops, that the city that had rejected him would learn what happened when barbarians were disrespected. But he never reached Rome, because a small city called Aquileia decided to resist, decided to close its gates, decided that surrender meant their daughters would be summoned to gatherings, decided that death in siege was preferable to survival under Maximinus. Aquileia was not prepared for siege, was not a military stronghold, was just a prosperous commercial city that happened to be in Maximinus's path. But its citizens understood what capture meant. They had heard the stories. They knew about the gatherings. They understood that if the city fell, the emperor would establish residence there and their daughters would receive invitations. So they fought. Civilians armed themselves, built barricades, manned walls, prepared to die rather than open the gates. Maximinus besieged them. His army outnumbered the defenders massively. His experience exceeded theirs infinitely. His forces should have taken the city in days, but they did not, because the citizens fought with the desperation of people who understood exactly what they were fighting against, who knew that surrender meant worse than death, who chose to die fighting rather than live under the giant's rule. The siege lasted months. Maximinus's army began to starve. Supply lines from the north were long and vulnerable. The region around Aquileia had been stripped of food. The soldiers were hungry. They were angry. They were beginning to question why they were besieging this city, why they were not being allowed to simply bypass it and march on Rome where the real prizes waited. And inside the camp, Maximinus continued his appetites, continued consuming his 40 pounds of meat per day while his soldiers starved, continued drinking his 7 gallons of wine while they went thirsty, continued maintaining his routines while they suffered. The contrast became unbearable. The giant emperor who seemed invincible began to seem selfish, began to seem like he cared more about his own comfort than their survival. In April of 238, a group of officers decided they had had enough. They gathered outside Maximinus's tent during the afternoon. They discussed what had to be done. Then they entered. Maximinus and his son Maximus were both inside. Both were killed quickly, stabbed repeatedly. The officers who killed them mounted their heads on poles, carried them through the camp, showed the army that the giant was dead, that the reign of terror was over, that they could now negotiate with the Senate rather than attacking Rome. The soldiers who had followed Maximinus for 3 years did not mourn. They cheered. They celebrated. They understood that his death meant survival, that marching on Rome under the giant would have ended badly, that the Senate's forces might have been defeated, but the cost would have been enormous, that killing their emperor gave them negotiating position, that they could offer the heads as peace gestures and receive pardons rather than facing punishment for 3 years of complicity in his crimes. This is what finally broke the machinery. Not internal resistance, not senatorial opposition, not moral awakening. Simple practical calculation by soldiers who decided their emperor was leading them toward destruction and that survival required his elimination. Maximinus was approximately 65 years old when he died. He had ruled for 3 years and 2 months. In that time, he had held dozens of gatherings, had processed over 100 senatorial daughters, had broken the Roman aristocracy more thoroughly than any previous emperor, had established a system of terror that worked perfectly until external pressure exceeded its capacity to maintain control. His death ended the gatherings, ended the summonses, ended the machinery of terror. But it did not end the suffering, because survivors like Lucia carried their damage long after the emperor who inflicted it was dead. Let me tell you about the aftermath, about what happened to survivors, about how families dealt with daughters who had been broken, about why the damage continued for decades after Maximinus's death. When Maximinus died, the apparatus dissolved. The palace outside Rome was seized by agents of the new emperors. The servants who had organized the gathering scattered or were killed to prevent them from testifying. The physicians who had treated injuries disappeared to avoid prosecution. The guards who had witnessed returned to their frontier posts and never spoke of what they had seen. The machinery was dismantled systematically. The evidence was destroyed deliberately. The empire wanted to forget, but survivors could not forget. Girls who were still being held in detention were released immediately. Just opened the gates and let them walk out. No ceremony, no apology, no acknowledgement of what had been done to them. Just released like prisoners after a sentence. Some walked home. Some wandered confused because they no longer remembered where home was. Some were found by family members who had been searching. Some were never found at all. The survivors who made it back to their families arrived broken. Parents who had sent away daughters received back strangers. Girls who had been bright and engaged had become silent and withdrawn. Girls who had been social and eager had become terrified of interaction. Girls who had planned futures had become unable to imagine tomorrow. Roman families did not understand trauma, did not have psychology, did not know about post-traumatic stress or dissociation, or the long-term effects of systematic abuse. They understood their daughters were damaged. They did not understand the damage was permanent. They kept expecting recovery, kept waiting for their girls to return to normal, kept hoping that time would heal what Maximinus had destroyed. Time did not heal. Time made it worse. Because survivors could not process what had happened to them, could not speak about it because the terror of being summoned again persisted even after Maximinus was dead, could not access the memories consciously because their minds had partitioned them away, could not integrate the experience because integration required language, and language could not contain what they had experienced. So they remained fractured, remained divided between the person they had been before and the damaged thing they had become, remained unable to function normally because normal function required psychological integration they could not achieve, remained trapped between past trauma and impossible future because the present was unbearable. Lucia Junia Balba died at age 20. 2 years after that gathering where she had been selected for special entertainment. 2 years of her family trying everything to help her, bringing physicians who found injuries that had healed physically but somehow had not healed psychologically, bringing priests who performed rituals that did not touch damage gods could not see, bringing anyone who claimed to heal minds that had been broken beyond what medicine could address. Nothing worked. Lucia remained locked in wherever she had gone during that entertainment, remained unable to speak about it, unable to function normally, unable to eat regularly or sleep peacefully or interact socially or plan any kind of future. She existed but did not live, functioned minimally but not meaningfully, survived in biological sense but was dead in every way that mattered. In the weeks before her death, she stopped eating entirely, stopped speaking altogether, stopped acknowledging the people around her. She went somewhere inside herself that was totally unreachable. Her body continued functioning, but her mind had surrendered, had decided that existence was no longer tolerable, had chosen the only escape available to someone trapped in memories that could neither be processed nor forgotten. She died quietly. Her heart simply stopped. The physician said it was natural causes, but her family understood. She had died because living was impossible, because carrying what Maximinus had done to her required strength she no longer possessed, because 2 years was as long as she could survive after that gathering, because what had happened to her in those hours of special entertainment continued killing her every day, until finally it succeeded. Lucia was one case among many. The senatorial families of Rome buried numerous daughters in the years following Maximinus's death, girls who had attended gatherings, girls who had been selected for special entertainment, girls who had survived the palace but could not survive its aftermath. The tombstones do not explain. The inscriptions say only that these young women died too soon, that their families mourned them, that they were loved. But the families knew, and Rome knew, and the knowledge changed things. The Senate never recovered its power. The families who had lost daughters withdrew from public life. They stopped participating in politics, stopped pursuing office. stopped engaging with the institutions they had dominated for centuries. They became cautious, defensive, focused on survival rather than governance. They had learned that speaking truth had costs measured in daughters' suffering. They learned to stay silent. The military took complete control, because the soldiers had killed Maximinus and the Senate had not, because the legions had demonstrated they were the real power in Rome, because the next emperor, and the one after that, and all the emperors for the next 50 years, would be military men who rose through violence and ruled through force. The crisis of the 3rd century began with Maximinus. His reign proved that barbarians could rule Rome, that soldiers could take power, that the aristocracy was irrelevant, that civilization was optional. And somewhere in all of this, the story of what actually happened got buried. The gatherings became footnotes. The special entertainment became euphemisms. The machinery of terror became academic discussions about political instability. The systematic abuse became passive voice constructions about victims whose agency had already been stolen, having their stories stolen again by scholarship that could not confront what it was describing. Until now. Until this video. Until you watched all the way through and learned what really happened, what Maximinus actually did, what Lucia actually experienced, what the special entertainment actually was, why survivors could not speak, why families could not help, why Rome tried to forget. Now you know. And now I need to explain why knowing matters, why this history is not just ancient horror but contemporary lesson, why understanding Maximinus teaches us something essential about power and bodies and violence and the machinery that enables systematic cruelty. Let me give you the lessons, the things you should take away from this story, the reasons why Lucia's suffering 17 centuries ago still matters today. First lesson. Physical abnormality plus absolute power creates possibilities for cruelty that normal humans cannot replicate. Maximinus was 8 feet tall. This was not metaphorical. This was biological abnormality. And it mattered. It mattered because his size created capacity for harm that normal emperors did not possess. His body was a weapon more effective than any other tool available to him. His abnormality enabled the special entertainment, made it possible, made it lethal, made it something that sources could not describe because normal human experience provided no framework for understanding violence at that scale. This matters because physical power still exists, still shapes interactions, still creates asymmetries that enable abuse. Understanding that abnormal physical capacity enables abnormal cruelty helps us recognize when size differences create danger rather than just hierarchy. Helps us see that 8 feet tall is not just description but warning. That extreme physical capacity creates moral obligation that Maximinus rejected completely. Second lesson. Systematic cruelty requires infrastructure. The gatherings did not happen spontaneously. They required planning, organization, logistics. The palace had to be transformed. Servants had to be hired. Physicians had to be retained. Equipment had to be acquired. Procedures had to be refined. This was bureaucratic, administrative, institutional. Maximinus did not personally manage all of this. He established the system and let it operate. This matters because systematic abuse always requires infrastructure, whether ancient Rome or modern institutions, whether emperors or administrators, whether gatherings or other forms of organized harm. Recognizing the infrastructure helps identify the system, helps interrupt the machinery, helps prevent future iterations. Because destroying individual abusers does not stop institutional abuse. You have to dismantle the apparatus. You have to eliminate the infrastructure. You have to break the system, not just the person. Third lesson. Trauma extends beyond the traumatized. Lucia died at 20, but her death was not the end of her story's effects. Her father lived with guilt for the objection that had drawn imperial attention. Her mother lived with watching her daughter disappear into herself. Her younger sisters lived with understanding that this could happen to anyone. Her family's servants lived with witnessing suffering they could not prevent. Her father's friends lived with knowing they might be next. Her class lived with terror that reshaped Roman aristocratic life for generations. This matters because trauma never affects only direct victims. It radiates outward through families, communities, societies. It changes everyone who witnesses or learns about or lives in proximity to systematic abuse. Understanding this helps us see that counting direct victims underestimates harm. That secondary trauma is real trauma. That systems of cruelty damage entire populations even when only some experience direct violence. Fourth lesson. Academic language can hide what it describes. The scholars who study Maximinus discuss his significance as first barbarian emperor, his military campaigns, his fiscal policies, his role in the crisis of the 3rd century. They mention the persecutions briefly. Note that he was cruel, reference the sources that describe gatherings. Then move to safer topics. This is not dishonesty, but it is distortion, because it treats systematic sexual abuse as political footnote rather than central feature of his reign. It sanitizes through distance. It protects readers from confronting what sources actually describe. This matters because academic language still does this, still creates distance from horror through passive voice and euphemism and clinical terminology, still protects scholarship from fully engaging with systematic abuse because full engagement is uncomfortable. Recognizing this helps us read between lines, helps us understand what unspeakable violations means, helps us translate academic distance back into human reality. Fifth lesson. Monsters are made, not born. Maximinus was not evil from birth. He was enormous. He was poor. He lived in a culture that valued strength above everything. He learned that violence worked. He spent 30 years in a military that rewarded brutality. He absorbed lessons about power and bodies and consumption. He rose to position where his appetites could be pursued without limits. Then he pursued them. This matters because it means systematic cruelty is environmental, is created by cultures and institutions and reward structures, is not genetic or inevitable or limited to people who are somehow fundamentally different. Any of us in Maximinus's circumstances, with his body and his experiences and his opportunities, might have done similar things. Understanding this is not excuse, is recognition that preventing future Maximinuses requires changing the systems that create them, not just punishing individuals after they emerge. These are the lessons. These are why Lucia's story matters. These are why remembering the gatherings is not just historical curiosity, but moral necessity. Because the machinery that enabled Maximinus still exists. The infrastructure of systematic abuse still operates. The academic distance that buries uncomfortable truth still functions. The environmental factors that create monsters still shape people. And because daughters like Lucia still suffer. Not from Roman emperors, but from systems and infrastructures and machineries that we allow to persist because confronting them is difficult, because dismantling them is expensive, because remembering victims is uncomfortable. Let me tell you about those victims. Let me give them names. Let me make them visible, because they deserve better than footnotes and euphemisms and academic distance, because they deserve to be remembered as people who suffered real suffering, because 17 centuries later, the least we can do is speak their names. For Lucia Junia Balba, who was 18 when the summons arrived, who wore her finest silks and her father's gold jewelry to a gathering that destroyed her, who was selected for special entertainment because her father spoke truth in the Senate, who survived 2 years after that night before her mind finally surrendered, who died at 20 having never recovered speech or function or any semblance of the person she had been, who left behind a father consumed by guilt, who left behind a mother who never stopped crying, who left behind sisters who learned to be silent, who left behind a name preserved only by legal accident 17 centuries later, who deserves to be remembered, who deserves to have her suffering acknowledged, who deserves better than we gave her. For Cornelia Amelia, who attended the same gathering, who witnessed what happened to Lucia and knew her turn was coming, who survived the entertainment but returned with injuries physicians could not explain, who lived into adulthood but never married or participated in social life, who died at 32 in a provincial villa far from Rome where no one knew her story, who carried her damage quietly for 14 years before her body finally failed, who deserves to be named and remembered and acknowledged. For Valeria Messalina, who was never returned at all, who died during a gathering, who experienced special entertainment that her body could not survive despite medical intervention, whose family received notification and financial settlement and no explanation, who was buried in a tomb that says only she died young, who deserves more than a marker with wrong cause of death, who deserves truth about how she died and who killed her and why Rome let it happen. For the dozens of other senatorial daughters who attended gatherings during Maximinus's 3 years, whose names survive in fragments, if at all, who experienced versions of what Lucia experienced, who returned broken or died during entertainment or survived years before trauma finally killed them, who have been reduced to statistics and footnotes and passive voice constructions, who were people, who felt terror and pain and betrayal, who died or survived damaged, who deserve individual recognition rather than collective anonymity. For the daughters from wealthy equestrian families, for the provincial nobility's girls, for everyone who was brought to those gatherings but who did not belong to the senatorial class and therefore were not documented, who suffered just as severely but whose suffering was not considered important enough to record, who died or survived broken without anyone writing down their names, who have left no trace in the historical record because they were not aristocratic enough to matter to sources, who numbered in dozens or hundreds, who deserve recognition equal to senatorial victims even though we cannot provide it because history did not care enough to preserve them. For the servants who organized the gatherings, who were complicit because refusing meant death, who carried guilt for participating, who witnessed horrors that marked them permanently, who scattered after Maximinus died and carried their memories into communities that never knew what they had done, who lived with knowledge they could not share and died with secrets they could not tell, who were also damaged by the machinery even though their damage was different, who deserve acknowledgement even for complicity because complicity under terror is not the same as willing participation. For the physicians who treated injuries during gatherings, who preserved lives so suffering could continue, who used their skills to enable the machinery, who faced impossible choices between refusing and allowing girls to die or participating and enabling abuse to continue, who made whatever accommodations with conscience allowed them to function, who were also trapped by the system even though their trap was different, who deserve recognition for their impossible position even as we judge their choices. For the families who welcomed broken daughters home, who tried everything to help, who brought physicians and priests and anyone who claimed ability to heal damaged minds, who watched their daughters fail to recover, who buried girls who had survived gathering but could not survive aftermath, who lived decades with guilt and grief and understanding that they had failed at the most basic parental duty, who were also victims even though their victimization was indirect, who deserve acknowledgement for suffering we cannot quantify, for everyone who lived through those 3 years, who knew what was happening, who heard the stories, who lived in terror of receiving summons, who watched the machinery operate and could not stop it, who were shaped by knowing that this could happen, that emperors could do this, that Rome could permit it, who lost faith in institutions and gods and the possibility that civilization meant anything other than organized violence with better architecture. They all deserve better than silence, better than euphemisms, better than footnotes, better than academic distance, better than 17 centuries of forgetting. They deserve to be remembered, not as examples or lessons or case studies, but as people who suffered, who felt real terror, who experienced real violation, who lived or died or survived damaged in the aftermath of real events that really happened. So I have remembered them. I have told their story. I have named them where sources allow naming. I have acknowledged them where names are lost. I have given them the full truth that scholarship preferred to bury. Now you remember them too. The places where this happened still exist. You can visit some of them, walk on ground where the gatherings occurred, touch stones that watched when Lucia screamed. The palace outside Rome where the entertainments happened is gone. The estate was confiscated after Maximinus died, changed hands repeatedly over the following centuries, eventually demolished or buried under later construction. Archaeologists believe they know its approximate location, but excavations have revealed little. The physical evidence has been erased by time and deliberate destruction. Perhaps that is mercy. Perhaps some places should not survive. Perhaps ground soaked in suffering that extreme should be allowed to disappear so no one has to walk on it knowing what happened there. Perhaps forgetting is sometimes appropriate, but the Danube frontier remains. The regions where Maximinus spent most of his reign are now Austria, Hungary, Romania, Serbia. The legionary camps that housed his forces have been excavated. The barracks and bathhouses and administrative buildings have been mapped. The ground where his soldiers lived has been studied extensively. And if you visit these sites, you can see something scholars do not mention. The command quarters were always isolated, positioned away from troop barracks, surrounded by walls within walls, accessible only through checkpoints. These architectural features were standard for Roman camps. They served legitimate purposes: security, privacy, dignity for commanders. But they also created spaces where things could happen without general visibility, where screams might not carry, where witnesses could be controlled, where systematic abuse could operate without ordinary soldiers necessarily knowing details, where emperors could hold gatherings and maintain deniability about what those gatherings involved. The architecture enabled the machinery, the design facilitated the system. The structures that still exist in archaeological sites across the Danube frontier are not just military installations. They are infrastructure of terror. They are the physical apparatus that made the gatherings possible. Aquileia still exists, the city that refused to open its gates, that chose siege over surrender, that fought to death rather than submit to Maximinus. You can walk its streets today, can see remnants of the walls that held against the giants' legions, can visit the basilica built on ground where citizens fought, knowing their daughters would attend gatherings if they lost. There is a memorial in Aquileia. It commemorates the siege, describes how the city resisted the emperor, notes that civilians fought alongside soldiers, mentions that women and children helped defend the walls. It is standard heroic narrative, brave resistance against tyranny, ordinary people standing up to military power. What the memorial does not mention is why they fought so desperately, what they were fighting against, what surrender would have meant for their daughters, what the gatherings were, what the special entertainment involved. The memorial sanitizes, makes the resistance about political freedom rather than existential terror, makes it comfortable, makes it suitable for tourists who want heroic history, not uncomfortable truth. But if you stand there knowing what you now know, the memorial means something different. The resistance was not just political, it was protective. Those civilians fought knowing what happened at gatherings, knowing what Maximinus did to senatorial daughters, understanding that if the city fell, their own daughters would be next. They chose death because they had learned from Rome's aristocracy that some things were worse than dying. This is what remains: stones and walls and memorials that tell comfortable lies, ground that knows truth but cannot speak it, places where suffering happened but evidence has been erased, ruins that tourists photograph without understanding what occurred there. And perhaps that is appropriate. Perhaps we should not make these places into destinations. Perhaps we should not encourage pilgrimage to sites where girls like Lucia were destroyed. Perhaps the appropriate response to ground soaked in that kind of suffering is to let it rest, to acknowledge what happened without making it spectacle, to remember without memorializing, to know without displaying. Perhaps the memorial Lucia deserves is not physical, is not marble or bronze, is this video, is your knowledge, is the fact that 17 centuries later someone told her full story. Someone refused to use euphemisms. Someone named her and explained what happened to her and why it matters. Perhaps remembering is the memorial. Perhaps knowing is the monument. Perhaps telling truth is how we honor dead who suffered systematic abuse. Perhaps that is enough. If you have watched this video to the end, you now know what happened to Lucia Junia Balba, what the special entertainment actually was, what she experienced during those hours beyond the door, what Maximinus did, what his physical abnormality enabled, what the machinery of terror actually looked like, what survivors carried, why families could not help, why Rome tried to forget. You know something that scholarship has buried for 17 centuries, something that historians mention only in euphemisms, something that textbooks reduce to footnotes, something that made me spend months researching before I felt confident enough to tell it. You know because Lucia deserves to be known, because her suffering should not be forgotten just because remembering is uncomfortable, because systematic abuse flourishes in silence and dies in exposure, because the machinery that destroyed her still operates in different forms, because understanding how infrastructure enables cruelty helps us recognize and dismantle similar systems today. You know because knowing matters, because history is not just about what happened, but about why it happened and how it happened and what it teaches us. Because Rome was the greatest empire in Western history and Rome permitted this. Because civilization is not protection against systematic cruelty. Because monsters are not aberrations but products of systems that we build and maintain and allow to persist. You know, because daughters still suffer, not from Roman emperors, but from systems and infrastructures and machineries that we allow to operate because dismantling them is difficult. Because the lessons from Maximinus are not ancient but contemporary. Because absolute power still corrupts, because physical abnormality still creates danger, because infrastructure still enables abuse, because trauma still radiates, because academic language still sanitizes, because monsters are still made by environments we create. Subscribe to this channel if you want more historical truth without euphemisms. Like this video if you think Lucia's story needed to be told completely. Comment below with your thoughts, because I need to know whether telling uncomfortable truth serves a purpose or just inflicts more suffering by forcing people to confront darkness they would prefer not to know exists. Share this video if you think others should know what really happened, but be careful who you share it with. This is not casual content. This is not entertainment in normal sense. This is historical truth that exceeds what most people are prepared to confront. This is scholarship without protective distance. This is what happens when someone refuses to use passive voice and euphemism and academic language to create safety from horror. This is what Maximinus Thrax actually did. This is what the gatherings actually were. This is what the special entertainment actually involved. This is what happened to daughters of senators who objected to barbarian rule. This is what Rome tried to forget. This is what I have remembered. This is what you now know. And knowing is not enough. Knowing is just the beginning. What matters is what you do with knowledge, whether you let it change how you see power and bodies and violence and systems, whether you use it to recognize similar patterns in contemporary contexts, whether understanding Lucia's suffering helps you prevent or interrupt or expose systematic abuse that operates today under different names in different institutions with different victims but the same fundamental machinery. That is why I told you this story. That is why I spent 50 minutes taking you through every detail. That is why I refuse to sanitize or distance or protect you from uncomfortable truth, because Lucia died so you could be comfortable, because her suffering purchased your safety, because 17 centuries later, the least we can do is acknowledge what she experienced fully and use that knowledge to build a world where daughters do not suffer for their father's courage. Remember her. Remember all of them. Remember what happens when physical abnormality meets absolute power, meets appetites without limits, meets infrastructure that enables systematic cruelty. Remember so it does not happen again. Remember so we recognize it if it starts happening. Remember so we interrupt the machinery before it processes another generation of victims. Remember Lucia Junia Balba, age 18, daughter of Senator Marcus Junius Balbus, summoned to a gathering 3 days after her father spoke truth in the Senate, selected for special entertainment, broken completely, died at age 20, remembered now, finally, truly, fully. She deserved better than she got, better than Rome gave her, better than history remembered her, better than the world treated her. She deserved to live, to marry, to have children, to grow old, to die peacefully surrounded by family who loved her. She got none of that. She got Maximinus instead. She got the gatherings. She got the special entertainment. She got 2 years of broken existence before trauma finally killed her. She got buried with wrong cause of death. She got forgotten by scholarship that preferred comfortable distance. She got reduced to footnote about political instability. Until now. Until you. Until this video gave her the full truth she deserved 17 centuries ago. That will have to be enough, because it is all we can give her now. Full truth. Complete knowledge. Absolute refusal to use euphemism or distance or protective language. Her story told the way it should have been told originally. That is her memorial. This video. Your knowledge. The fact that someone finally told truth without sanitizing it. Rest in peace, Lucia Junia Balba. Your story has been told. Your suffering has been acknowledged. Your name has been spoken. You have been remembered. Finally. Completely. Honestly. Let me explain something crucial about how human minds respond to overwhelming trauma, because understanding this helps explain why survivors like Lucia could not recover, why families' attempts to help failed, why the damage was permanent despite best efforts. When humans experience trauma that exceeds their capacity to process, the mind employs defense mechanisms. Dissociation is primary among these. The mind essentially separates the traumatic experience from conscious awareness, creates a partition, locks the memory away where it cannot be accessed deliberately. This happens automatically. This is not choice, but survival reflex. This is how consciousness protects itself from experiences that would destroy it if fully integrated. For mild trauma, this mechanism helps. It allows the person to function while the mind slowly processes what happened. Eventually, the memory can be accessed, can be integrated, can be understood and accommodated within the person's ongoing narrative. The dissociation is temporary, recovery is possible. But for extreme trauma, dissociation becomes permanent. The experience is so overwhelming that the mind never develops capacity to integrate it. The partition becomes permanent wall. The memory remains locked away, but locked away does not mean gone. The traumatic experience continues affecting the person, continues shaping responses, continues generating symptoms. But the person cannot access why, cannot explain their own reactions, cannot connect their current dysfunction to past trauma because the connection has been severed by dissociation. This is what happened to the survivors. They dissociated during the gatherings as survival mechanism. Their minds partitioned the experiences away. But those experiences were so extreme that integration never became possible. The dissociation became permanent state. The survivors could not remember clearly what happened, could not describe their experiences, could not explain why they felt what they felt or did what they did. They were trapped by their own mind's attempts to protect them. The symptoms manifested without explanation. A survivor might panic when entering enclosed spaces. She does not remember why, does not consciously connect enclosed spaces to the private chambers. But her body remembers. Her hindbrain remembers. The panic is real even though she cannot explain it. Family members trying to help cannot understand why she reacts this way, cannot help her avoid triggers they cannot identify, cannot provide comfort for fear they cannot comprehend. Similarly with sounds, a survivor might become distressed by drums or flutes. Music that had been neutral becomes unbearable. She cannot explain why, cannot connect the sounds to the gatherings consciously. But the sounds trigger the partitioned memories, bring them close to consciousness without making them accessible, create overwhelming anxiety without clear cause. Family and physicians interpret this as irrational behavior. Try to expose her to the sounds to help her overcome her fear, make things worse by reinforcing the trauma without providing any mechanism for processing it. Touch became impossible for many survivors. Being touched triggered memories of being restrained, being hurt, being violated. But the survivors could not articulate this, could not say, "Being touched reminds me of the gatherings," because they could not access the memories consciously. They just knew that touch created panic, created need to escape, created overwhelming distress. Their families interpreted this as rejection, as choosing isolation over connection, tried to force contact to maintain relationship, created additional trauma through attempts to help. Food triggered memories for some survivors. Certain smells or textures or temperatures reminded them of the palace, of meals eaten while detained, of physical states during or after sessions. But they could not identify these connections, could only experience the nausea or refusal or panic that certain foods generated. Families worried about malnutrition, tried to force eating, created power struggles that reinforced the survivor's sense of having no control, made things worse through attempts to help. Sleep became impossible, not just difficult, impossible, because sleep meant dreams. Dreams meant the partitioned memories becoming accessible, becoming vivid, becoming real again. Survivors would wake screaming, would spend hours in panic states, would refuse to sleep again because the dreams were unbearable. Families tried sedatives, tried enforced rest, tried everything to help their daughters sleep. Nothing worked because the problem was not physical, was psychological, was trauma manifesting through dreams because consciousness during waking hours was maintaining dissociative barriers that sleep dissolved. All of these symptoms made sense given what the survivors had experienced, but without ability to access the traumatic memories, without ability to connect symptoms to causes, without therapeutic frameworks for processing trauma, the symptoms appeared irrational, appeared like choices rather than compulsions, appeared like the survivors were refusing to recover rather than being unable to recover. This is why families' help failed. They were treating symptoms without understanding causes. They were trying to fix behaviors without addressing the trauma that generated them. They were attempting to force recovery through willpower and discipline when what was needed was therapeutic intervention that Rome did not possess. They were doing their best with tools that were inadequate for the task. Their daughters needed treatment that would not exist for 17 centuries. They lived in the wrong time for healing that might have saved them. Understanding these mechanisms helps us see why Lucia and the others could not recover, why medical treatment failed, why religious intervention failed, why time did not heal, why family support was not sufficient. The trauma they experienced exceeded the treatment capacity of their civilization. They needed psychology, needed therapy, needed frameworks for understanding and processing systematic abuse. Rome had none of these. Rome could only watch them suffer and document their decline and bury them when they died and wonder what had gone wrong. This is what Maximinus did. Not just physical damage, psychological damage that exceeded repair, systematic destruction that continued long after the gatherings ended, long after he was dead, long after the machinery was dismantled. The survivors carried his cruelty forward, carried it in symptoms they could not explain, in reactions they could not control, in suffering that persisted until eventually it killed them. This is why the gatherings matter, why understanding them is important, why telling this story fully serves a purpose. Because systematic trauma creates damage that extends far beyond immediate experience, creates suffering that persists across years and decades, creates ripples that affect everyone who encounters survivors, creates lessons that remain relevant across 17 centuries.